Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming. My name is Hollow and this is my rogue. Crazy to think that I made this rogue this week and it's now level 70 already. As we've been maining Sorcerer, Necromancer and Druid here on the channel, it's finally time for some alts and to cover the remaining classes. Today I'm starting with the most meta build of the rogue, which is the Deathtrap rogue. But why is this so strong? Why is it so meta? I'd heard about it whenever I looked at rogues, even more so than this Twisting Blades build, and now I think I know why. It's the simple nature of having a pull-in before then crushing all the mobs that are collected up being so impactful. Necromancers have their version with corpse tendrils, Barbarians and Sorceress, they have their pull-ins. It's clearly a concept that's going to be strong always from mob clearing, and the Deathtrap in particular is a huge self-CD resetting version of that. Then we have it combined with the insanely strong Twisting Blades themselves, which massively help with the reducing of cooldown times, like for Deathtrap, so that's just good synergy. Combine all that with the hyper mid-combat movement via dashing and shadow step, all while applying constant vulnerability from the amazing puncture basic attack or the traps themselves. It always sounded amazing, so it's great to finally try it myself, make some changes for my build, and what I've got here feels incredible. As you can see, I'm easily able to push content well above my level. Here I'm calmly pushing a tier 36, which has enemies 20 levels above me for the better glyph XP. Or if I go back down to, more reasonably just 3 or 4 levels above myself right now, well then I am crushing those in insanely fast times. So it's been great for leveling. Overall, the pace of this build is awesome. For its AoE mob clear, I'm very impressed. And still, the single target, it still crushes, so I'm not really seeing a weakness. With that said then, let's show the build. As always, we'll begin with the skill tree. I'll just give a quick scroll down all the way to the bottom so you can see each individual tier and tree to begin with, so you can see all the points so nothing's missing. Starting with the basic puncture, a constant mini range attack which can enhance to restore more energy and permanently cause vulnerability. It's got to be one of the easiest, most effective ways to maintain vulnerable on a target or multiple targets out of anything I've ever seen. So I'm not surprised everyone's using it. Then we have Twisting Blades. It's a core ability, of course. We 5 out of 5 this to maximize its damage. Modify it, which massively increases the returning damage. And then we go for Advanced Twisting Blades, the thing that means we actually reduce our cooldowns. The more enemies the blades come back through. That is how we're largely resetting our longer cooldowns, so it's very important. Also in this tree, we're going to be picking up Sturdy at 3 out of 3. A 12% close damage reduction is very nice, but I only go for 2 levels on Siphoning Strikes. This is to allow for other points elsewhere, we'll explain, but this means we get some healing back as we crit strike close enemies, which is nice to have. Then we come down to the agility tree where we get all our mobility. First up we have Shadow Step, which we're going to enhance for the extra damage to the target that we're actually Shadow Stepping to, and it makes Shadow Step a potential stun, which is incredible. The other mobility option we have is Dash, applying the debuff that is Enhanced Dash, meaning enemies hit by dash take 15% times increased critical strike damage for 5 seconds. That's a long time and a massive bonus. Here we also pick up 3 out of 3 on Weapon Mastery to improve the power of our swords and daggers. Ideally we're using swords, so that's just very good for that particularly. Then we have the other passives here like Concussive. Whenever we knock down or back an enemy, we get increased critical strike chance against them. 1 level in Rapid Gambits gives our evade a CDR effect, which is awesome. And 1 level in Trick Attacks means whenever we critically strike a dazed enemy, they're then knocked down, which stacks and helps with Concussive. One of our main aspects we'll talk about actually has a way for us to consistently daze enemies, so that's where that synergy comes in. Next we come down to the trap tree where we get Poison Trap. I actually have 1 level in this, but I'm getting 5 from my items to get its damage nice and up. We enhance that to make it a knockdown, and then Subverting Poison Trap actually massively increases the poison damage to the enemies standing in it, which can be nice. Also in the passive here we have 3 out of 3 on Exploit, increasing our damage massively to healthy and then injured enemies. And then 3 out of 3 on Malice, which is our best passive by far. 3 out of 3 will give you 9% times increased damage to vulnerable enemies. This is permanently happening, so it's just a big damage increase. This passive is so strong that I recommend you get Malice levels on any equipment you can. As you can see, I've got 3 extra levels, doubling how much it does. Then we get the passives to enhance our traps. We have Deadly Venom just to get to the next points. Alchemy Advantage at just 1 level gives us some nice attack speed to each enemy we're poisoned up to 15%, so from AoE. But most importantly, 3 out of 3 on Debilitating Toxins. We poison enemies via the Poison Trap and they deal less damage. Spread that around in a pack of enemies and now we've got some really nice damage reduction. Down on the ultimate tree, we of course pick up Deathtrap. We fully enhance it with Prime Deathtrap and then Supreme Deathtrap. If it kills an enemy, you get 10 seconds off the cooldown. Then, as you can see, we have a load of passive options here. Firstly, we have Innovation. This gives us a 30% chance to gain 8 energy, which is amazing. Trap Mastery, we get a nice 12% crit strike chance against vulnerable and crowd-controlled enemies, which is pretty constant to say the least. We have 2 levels in Aftermath, meaning whenever we used our ultimate skill Deathtrap, we get 50 energy back. We actually have benefits the more energy we have, so that's an important one. Then we have 1 level in Adrenaline Rush. This gives us some nice energy regen while moving, but it's mostly just to get us to the next thing, which is Haste. While at or above 50% max energy, we gain movement speed, but while below, we gain attack speed. So just some nice benefits to do with our resource. Finally though, our key passive Exposure. It's a lucky hit effect. As we deal damage to people affected by trap skills, we have a 25% chance to reduce the active cooldowns of trap skills by 20%, or even drop a cluster of stun grenades for a stun. This just means by spreading our traps around and dealing damage to those targets, we can massively reduce the cooldown of, say, Deathtrap, which leads to ridiculous mob clear potential. But then we also have the specializations. In our case, we want Inner Sight. As we target enemies that have the mark above them, we regularly get unlimited energy for 4 seconds. This works in perfect synergy with a lot of our passives, but also a very important aspect in the case of Edge Masters, dealing increased damage based on how much of our resource we have. But now it's time for the Paragon boards. While I just hover over each board, I just want to say that I found that the legendary nodes for Rogue and this build particularly aren't that good. There's basically 2 that seem to be relevant that can be good, and then the rest just don't seem that useful. So it seems to be a lot more about, say, glyph sockets than anything else, as well as particular rare nodes you can get on certain boards. On the starting board, we're going to be going towards the glyph of Closer. This is because we need damage reduction and defensive options. We come around to the right to pick up the rare node Prime for the increased damage, then come up to the center and pick up the glyph socket, which is where we're putting in Closer. Closer's great on the starter board because it requires 40 dex, which you can easily get without actually upgrading it to level 15, which is a rare thing. Closer, when secondary activated, means when you've got a melee weapon equipped, you just take 10% reduced damage straight up. So that is a massive damage reduction option, probably the best I could see. It also increases the damage of our cutthroat skills the more we level it though, which is not a bad thing. Anyway, we pick up enough dex to actually activate that, grab both of the rare nodes on both sides and come up out on the left. Later on, coming back to spend more points on this to level it more and pick up more magic nodes, but I'm only level 70, so we got to keep going. For our first board upgrade then, we're picking up the Deadly Ambush board. This legendary node massively increases the critical strike damage to enemies affected by trap skills, so a poison trap or a death trap, they are just way more vulnerable. To achieve that, we'll start by coming around to the left just to pick up the rare node Trapper, increasing our trap skill damage. Remember, if Deathtrap actually kills, it resets its cooldown by 10 seconds, so that's pretty major. But we have to min-max our way to the legendary node as soon as possible by ignoring the rest of the magic nodes there for now. Then I'm coming up to the glyph socket, just going straight up directly to it, and here we have Diminish. This requires only 25 strength to get going, and we take 10% reduced physical damage from vulnerable enemies. Again, this build has permanent vulnerability on basically every enemy due to its basic attack and traps also triggering vulnerability. Rogue is a squishy class, so having 2 defensive Paragon glyphs to start us off just seems logical. So we make sure we pick up 25 strength here. I'm also going to pick up the 2 rare nodes since they're right there, increasing our damage to trap affected enemies and reducing the damage of those affected by traps, which nicely leads us out to the right to leave the glyph and move out from the board. I will mention that the rare node down here, Spring Loaded, is good, but I just need to keep progressing because I only have so many points. I'm only level 70. On that note, we come to our next board, which is indeed the Cheap Shot board. This legendary node increases our damage by a multiplier for each nearby enemy crowd controlled up to 25% times. A big damage increase, especially when we're AoE death trapping anyway. So another no-brainer for a build like this. I would recommend that you move across the board straight to the right and then go up to the right to pick up the legendary node first. Then we'll go down and pick up the glyph socket, which in this case we can finally get some damage increasing ones, and an obvious choice for a permanent vulnerability build is Exploit. This just straight up increases our vulnerable damage, which is just a no-brainer, and its secondary effect causes vulnerability to trigger whenever we damage an enemy. So spread the vulnerability and increase the damage it does. That's obviously a great choice. It requires 25 strength in this case, so we just level up that area to make sure we get that strength. And I'm also making an effort to pick up Wiles. Since I'm permanently slowing enemies, which we'll explain in the gear section, that's just a nice pickup. In any case, now that we've got that glyph sorted out, we move up and to the left and go through Safeguard, giving us some nice damage reduction against elites. Moving our way through the magic nodes and up to the next board, where I am beginning to level, as you can see, the tricks of the trade board, where I'm going to ignore this legendary node. And in fact, I'm not really looking for any more legendary nodes because they're not that relevant. Why this board then? Because it's going to smoothly allow us to move up and to the left to pick up a glyph and then leave the board at the left for this next board. This particular board, the tricks of the trade, has two rare nodes that I like the look of. There's Brawler, increasing damage to close enemies and damage reduction from close enemies, a double up, and Havoc, which increases our crit strike damage and physical damage, which is amazing. For this board and the glyph, when I do reach it, I'm looking at Combat, which requires 25 intelligence to trigger, and it's a major energy helper because it makes any skill that critically strikes just restore some of the energy cost, making them straight up cheaper, which is just awesome. Also, improve critical strike damage for core skills. Don't mind if I do. So we're looking to get that in the next glyph. I'm also working on getting it to level 15 to enhance that. But as I'm only level 70, this is what I've achieved so far and why. Again, there are other rare nodes that I would pick up if I had the points to spare, but I just don't have them right now. Now we move on to the gear section, which is arguably very important as always. I have what I'm running right now and what I can suggest to you as alternatives. To begin with, let's highlight our weapon, which is specifically a crossbow. Crossbows come with vulnerability damage increases, so as a vulnerable base build, of course we want that. Then it's a two-hand weapon, so this is where we want our most damaging thing to go, and this is for Blade Dancer's aspect, causing the twisting blades to orbit around us, dealing a % of damage, and increasing the damage that they deal based on the distance that they hit on the return. We want this as high as possible, so on a two-hand weapon, that's the biggest increase. The crossbow that you have doesn't matter in terms of its DPS, it just needs to have an item power of 725 or higher to get the highest rolls on the affixes. For my weapons, I've currently got an awkward setup. As you can see, I've got a dagger and a sword. I'd rather have two swords. Swords increase the critical strike damage, which is generally going to be better than damage to close enemies, though that's not bad at all. But as I mentioned in the skill tree part, weapon mastery, the swords get a big straight damage increase, where daggers only get an increase to healthy enemies. So swords are just universally more reliable. In any case, on one of these weapons, I have Edge Masters, improving the damage that we deal with our skills based on our current resource. The max benefit is when we're at full energy, and that happens whenever we have Inner Sight for 4 full seconds, which is a massive DPS increase. On the other one, we have Synergy. The roll on this doesn't matter as much as you might think. Whenever we use an agility skill, it reduces the cooldown of our next subterfuge skill, which is basically our trap. So whenever we dash or shadow step, it reduces the cooldown of poison trap and all-important Deathtrap. The other part of this means that our traps increase the damage of our next agility skill, which would be dash or shadow step. But that matters a lot less because, yeah, they're not like the main damage of this build. Twisting blades is. Still, having a higher roll is better, but not as important as it might seem. But now the armor and the jewelry. Starting with head. My general rule is to have 3 defensive aspects when going for endgame content. The first defensive aspect in this case is the protector aspect, which gives you a nice barrier when dealing damage to an elite. The incredible might aspect is on my chest piece, reducing damage we take every time we use our basic skill, which we're using all the time in the case of puncture, to make enemies vulnerable. The top roll gives us 6 seconds of this effect though, so as long as we use the puncture every 6 seconds, we just have that permanent 20% damage reduction. That is huge. Then our third defensive aspect is found on the legs, which is a no-brainer, obvious choice, Disobedience, the massive spike of armor, reducing the physical damage we take. This scales instantly based on your damage and is the best defensive aspect in the game. I have kind of a low roll on this one right now, and hopefully I'll find a better one soon. Then we have our gloves as a more offensive option. The Mangler's aspect basically means when we deal damage to a vulnerable enemy, we have a chance to daze them. This is really important when we again review the skill tree with trick attacks. When you critically strike a dazed enemy, they are then knocked down. Knocked down enemies are now taking 12% increased critical strike chance from me for 3 seconds, so it's just incredible burst whenever that happens, and Manglers makes that possible. But what about the boots? Well, I found them, the Penitent Greaves. This causes me to leave a trail of frost that chills enemies, and I deal bonus damage to chilled enemies. There are many synergies that I have or positive affixes on my armor that increases the damage I deal to slowed or chilled enemies. It's rare to find a straight damage increasing boot option, and so these are going to be great for many classes. If you do not have them, I would recommend the Ravager's aspect, which sadly can only go on amulets and boots. Otherwise, I probably would have had this on my head instead of the barrier aspect because I don't rate it that high. This gives you an extra charge of Shadow Step, which is just really nice because it is an unstoppable effect. So if you get stunned, you can Shadow Step out of it to save your life. Having 2 charges of that is really good. Then if you kill an enemy with Shadow Step, it'll refund the charge, which is nice, and increasing its damage. But I care more about the second charge to get out of stun situations. When it comes to my current amulet then, we're running the Blast Trappers. Dealing damage to enemies affected by traps has a chance to make them vulnerable. So that's how our traps are making enemies vulnerable. We want this chance to be as high as possible, so it goes on the amulet. When it comes to the rings though, we have Accelerating aspect. Critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed. For a top roll, that's 25% increase, which is quite hefty. And on the second ring, we have a resource generator. For most classes, the Umbral aspect is top tier, but you need to have a higher roll of 3 or 4 to make it worth it. Say the Codex one that only gives 1 of your primary resource, it's just not that good. So if you don't have like a high roll of Umbral, which gives resources based on crowd control enemies, then I would recommend what I was running till I got that Ravenous aspect. Killing a vulnerable enemy grants you up to 70% increased energy regen for 4 seconds. The problem is it requires to kill an enemy, which might not happen in single target against an elite or a boss, so Umbral is a bit more reliable in that certain situation. Both are good though, and either one will work. When it comes to the affixes on the gear then, let's talk about it. For defensive affixes, you'll look for bonus armor and max health, which I think are top tier defensive options. After that, general stuff like raw damage reduction and damage reduction from close and far enemies, those are also great. I've got a 4 out of 4 on my chest piece, so I'm very happy with that. For DPS based affixes, we're looking for things like vulnerable damage, crit strike chance, and critical strike damage as top tier. You want these. After that, I'd look for damage to close enemies, core skill damage, and lucky hit as a nice bonus, with less priority than say crit strike chance, damage, and vulnerable damage. You can also see how I got those 3 levels of malice on my amulet, so if you can get that, absolutely get it. Other things like utility, all stats, dexterity is your primary stat, cooldown reduction, move speed, those are nice to have, but not as important in my opinion. Also, as you can see for this whole time, in my armor, as always, I've got the rubies for max health as a gem. In this case, I go for emeralds for vulnerable damage increase on my weapons, and we can get 4 total, which is amazing. And then skulls, as always, for increased armor for the physical damage reduction that they provide. Lastly, let's do a quick rundown on how the gameplay generally goes. Your goal is to use Deathtrap and then reset Deathtrap's cooldown as smoothly as possible. As mentioned, when Deathtrap kills an enemy, its cooldown is reduced by 10 seconds, which is major. But Twisting Blades reduces your active cooldowns by up to 2 seconds the more enemies it passes through. So our goal is to target a specific enemy like an elite or an enemy with an annoying debuff and Shadow Step to them. This will hard stun them, making them take more damage. We can place a poison trap under them to make them take more damage while they're standing in it and give us a load of buffs. We can Death Trap to get that going, pull everyone in straight into the poison trap we just placed, smash a few Twisting Blades into the target to get them going, and then dash through the enemies and out and away. As they're all stacked up, your Twisting Blades will go through all of them, maximizing how much CDR you get. They'll all be standing and pulled into a poison trap, providing loads of benefits. You've dashed through them, making them take increased critical strike damage, and you stunned the primary target, making them even more vulnerable. So Shadow Step to the primary target, Poison Trap, Death Trap, Twisting Blades, and dash out. For single target, you just generally want to make sure vulnerability is always on the target. You're maintaining your dash debuff and trying to keep them inside of a Poison Trap at all times. But there you have it. That is my overview of the current Death Trap meta build. Like I said, going into this, it just sounded really good on paper. I'm not surprised that it feels amazing. And I found so many synergies between literally the aspects on my gear and the talent trees that we've been talking about. It's important to know how that all works. Otherwise, there's no point taking that talent or using that aspect. So I hope that in my explanations, I've shown how these synergies work. And so if you don't have them yet, you don't have to use those points or whatever. This is my first time making a build guide for Rogue though, so I hope it was okay. But if you guys have any bonus tips or extra stuff for Rogues, then you can drop it in the comments. But I now plan to continue covering Rogue, and there's a lot of really cool builds that this class has that I'm looking forward to trying when I have them. For now though, I've been Hollow, you've been you. Thanks for watching, we'll see you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.